Hello, my name is Michael Johnston, and this is going to be a response video to Braxton Hunter's video, 7 Questions for Atheists. So, I'm going to be brutally honest here. I'm really sorry to say this because Braxton Hunter really seems like he's trying to not be disingenuous, to open a dialogue, to open a fair discourse where he's not trying to be insulting or demeaning to atheists. But I really got to say, man, the way he frames the questions and the very questions themselves fall into the same trap of a lot of Christian questions, where they bespeak a misunderstanding of critical thinking skills, logic, and epistemology, which either means that Braxton Hunter doesn't have a very good grasp of critical thinking or logic or epistemology, or else he's just being disingenuous. And I'm really sorry to say that, because he started off his video very well by saying he doesn't want to have a gotcha question, he doesn't want to go into debate mode and so on, but unfortunately that's exactly what he does here with a lot of these questions. And so I have to treat the questions in that vein. So with regards to question 1, this question is hugely problematic, and boy oh boy, where do I... Okay, so with regards to question 1, there are 4 main problems with the question. So the first problem with the question, okay, he lists a bunch of different things that Christianity supposedly accounts for, and then says, how come your worldview doesn't account for them? This is a fallacy, okay? What he is saying is that Christianity is coherent. That is to say that Christianity's answer to question A and Christianity's answer to question B do not contradict each other. Whether you accept Christianity or not, Christianity is not incoherent. It doesn't offer an answer. It's the internal logic of Christianity does not contradict itself. Now, I don't want to ramble on, so I'm going to make a little analogy. I'm sorry, I'm going to make analogies throughout this video. Truth is a disease, and coherence is a symptom of the disease. If something is true, we would expect it to be coherent, as in it doesn't have any internal contradictions. But the inverse is not true. Merely because something is coherent does not mean that it has to be true. There can be coherent ideas that are untrue, okay? So an example would be like Marxism. So one of Marxism's claims to fame is that Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels used Hegelian logic, dialectical materialism, to have this really elegant explanation of all these really old left-wing ideas that go back to the French Revolution and before. And it was a very coherent ideology, but just because it's coherent and doesn't have any internal contradictions doesn't mean it's true. We would expect a true idea to be coherent, but the inverse is simply not true. And so the fact that Christianity offers coherent explanations to a bucket list of different questions doesn't mean Christianity is true. That's the first problem. The second problem is, why do I have to account for these things? Okay, here's a bucket list of things. What criteria did you use to get stuff on there? Like the rapid expansion of the early church. I don't think that there was a rapid expansion of the early church the way Christians imagine it. I don't want to beleaguer this point, this is an example of the gatekeeping fallacy. So he's looking at something that he cherishes, Christianity, and then he creates a list of ideas that his cherished thing happens to live up to. Here's a bucket list, a box checking exercise, A, B, C, that Christianity, which incidentally he believes in, happens to meet all those boxes, and other things don't. So that's a gatekeeping fallacy. He created his own criteria and asks other people to live up to it. He doesn't offer me any explanation as to why things have to be on that list. So that's the second problem. Third problem, okay, is the third problem here is he's being disingenuous, because I don't think Christianity even does account for all of those things anyway. Because remember, he said Christianity. Christianity, we know, is divided into thousands, hundreds of thousands of different denominations. And there's very little we can say about Christianity in any universal or generalized way. So he says Christianity, which would imply every Christian everywhere of every denomination, is going to give you the same answers to all the things he just said. And we know that that's simply not true. So even his basic assertion is wrong, because I'm sure that, like, for example, the Roman Catholic Church might have a different explanation for why the early Christianity spread the way it did relative to, the Southern Baptist Convention or some other group of people, or why does sin exist? Why do we have to? There are some universals within Christianity, sure, but there's a lot of stuff in Christianity that isn't universal, and he's just being disingenuous. He probably just means his version of Christianity, his church or his denomination. I'm going to go out on a limb and say that maybe whatever branch of Christianity he belongs to offers a neat and tidy, cut and dry explanation to all that stuff. And remember, like I said, being coherent, being cut and dry doesn't make you right. But even if that's true, does that apply to everybody? So that's kind of disingenuous too. And there's also a fourth problem. Forget it. I'm going to move on. With regards to question 2, again, we run into a huge problem here where Braxton Hunter either, I don't know if he's just pretending he doesn't understand critical thinking, epistemology, logic, stuff like this, or else he's just doing this on purpose. Okay, so I'm going to try. Really don't want to ramble. Okay, so basically, let me explain it like this, and I'm going to use layman's terms, so don't beat me up. I'm trying to give you the gist of what we mean, okay, or at least what I mean. So a lot of people foolishly believe that there's 2 positions, true and false. That's not how it works. There are 3 positions: proven, disproven, unproven. 3 positions: proven, disproven, unproven. And the second 2 are both wrong. They're wrong. There's one way to be right. There are 2 ways to be wrong, okay? Only something in the first pile, the proven dog pile, gets to be part of my worldview, gets to be part of anybody's worldview. The other 2, both of these are wrong. They're 2 different species of wrong, but they're both wrong, and I do not subscribe to them, okay? Now, what we atheists are saying, okay, let me back up actually. In the world of modern critical thinking, epistemology, logic, all this stuff, the default position for anything is this third category here, unproven. Every idea, every theory, every claim ever thought of begins its life in the unproven category. And remember, unproven is wrong. So your idea by default is always wrong. You are wrong, your ideas are wrong, and they remain wrong as an unproven until you move from this box to one of these other 2 boxes, either proven or disproven. And the way that there's only one method that lets you move between any of these things, and that is experimental reproducibility, empiricism. You have to use methodological naturalism to move between these 3 dog piles, okay? So what we atheists are saying is that God is in this category here. God is unproven. There is no demonstration that God exists. There is no demonstration that God does not exist. So God is not in the disproven category, and he is not in the proven category. He is in the unproven category. And remember, unproven and disproven, both of these categories are wrong. The only way you get to be right is if you're already proven to be right. So, for example, quantum string theory is in the unproven category, so it's wrong. Flat Earth is in the disproven category, so it's wrong. And then the theory of evolution is in the proven category, so it's right, okay? God is in the unproven category. Now, rather than ramble on and explain this shit to stupid people, we atheists just say, I lack a belief in God. That's what you're supposed to say when something is in the unproven category. I lack a belief in God. I don't believe in the flat Earth. I do believe in evolution, okay? Do you understand how that works? Now, in everyday life, when something is in either the unproven or disproven categories, because they're both wrong, they're different species of wrong, but they're both wrong, we usually just in layman's terms, you just say, I don't believe that, or I don't think that's true. But because Christian people, I'm really sorry to say this, but a lot of you guys are disingenuous and you try to pretend like you don't understand the difference. We atheists have to be a little bit more precise. So we say, God is in the unproven category. So I don't positively assert that there's a God, or I lack a belief in God. Okay, just like I lack a belief in quantum string theory. It hasn't been proven or disproven, therefore it's in this category here. Now, why do we compare that to Santa Claus? Well, here's the thing. It's actually a little bit more complicated than this because there's three basic categories, but there is different levels of certainty or likelihood for things in different categories. Now, you can't quantify something like that, like, 50% likelihood, 70% likelihood, 30% likelihood that I might believe it. It's not really feasible to do that. I mean, sometimes you can, like there's Bayesian theorems, but those are for specific things. So we just do it by analogy, and I say, okay, God is in the unproven category, and the likelihood that he's ever going to get out of this unproven category is probably the same that Santa Claus is going to get out of that unproven category, or elves. Because you're absolutely right. There's about as much likelihood of God getting out of this. See, elves, the belief in elves is also in the unproven category. I haven't seen everywhere in the universe, so I don't know that elves don't exist, but I'm pretty sure they don't. They're technically in the unproven category, but the elves pretty close to disproven, but they're technically here. So what we say is I lack a belief in elves, but they're really tenuous anyway. They're probably never going to get out of this. They likely don't exist. And the same thing with God. That's why we say I believe in God the same way I believe in vampires. Now, we could just cut the crap out and just say, hey, I don't believe in God. But because Christians will disingenuously try to say that we put God in the disproven category. And from the standpoint of epistemology and critical thinking, we can't do that because God is technically unproven. And elves are technically unproven, not disproven, unproven, but this is where they stand, and boy, they are not very tractable. They're probably not true. That's what we mean. We have to phrase it that way because Christians like to pretend that they don't understand the proven, disproven, unproven. This is how it works. There's three categories: proven, disproven, unproven. And the only way you get to jump around you always start here in unproven by default, and the only way you get to move around is with methodological naturalism. Sorry, boy, that's how it works. You don't like it? Tough. So with regards to question 3, the short answer is sure. I can understand how somebody who is a Christian and who subscribes to those beliefs might look at a person who is not a Christian like me and be like, oh, look, you're sinful or whatever. But this is putting the wagon before the horse, man, because the reason why I'm not a Christian is because I don't see any evidence for any of their claims. And therefore the other things that follow from the claim, like certain behavioral modes, are things I don't believe in. I don't believe, for instance, and oh boys, this question is just also, there's a lot of problems here. Now, atheists, like I keep trying to say, an atheist is merely a person who lacks a belief in God. We think God is in the unproven category. Now, because that's the case, atheism is not a worldview, okay? So we don't have an organized list of things. It's like saying collecting stamps is a hobby. It's not. Not collecting stamps is a hobby. So collecting stamps is something people do, and there are certain changes that they have to make to their life in order to be a successful stamp collector, right? Now, I don't collect stamps. So because I don't collect stamps, the other things that follow from being a stamp collector, like I have to put aside money for that activity, I have to buy special equipment in order to keep my stamps taken care of. That stuff just doesn't apply to my life. Now, from the standpoint of a person who is a lifelong stamp collector, they probably scratch their head and be like, hey, wow, that dude doesn't even save 10% of his income for buying stamps, and he doesn't even have like a table with a glass thing on top of it so that he could put his stamps underneath there and keep them dry. How can you not own a table with a glass top to put stamps underneath. That's an unusual. That's an immoral behavior. That's unusual behavior that you would own something. You wouldn't own a glass tabletop to put stamps underneath. So maybe from the standpoint of somebody like that, I can understand if they grew up in the world of stamp collecting and everybody they knew was a stamp collector, how they would look at a person like me and create what they call a false equivalency, where they say people who collect stamps, their worldview, their lifestyle is buying glass tables so that they can put tables with glass covers to put stamps inside, and people who are not stamp collectors, they have it as part of their worldview that they don't buy glass tables. You see, that's a false equivalence. It's not that it's part of my worldview or not part of my worldview. It's that I don't collect stamps. So other things that follow from that aren't things I care about. So it's the same thing with Christianity. So Christianity says homosexuality is wrong. Christianity says these other things over here are wrong. Because I'm not a Christian, I don't follow things that come out of their logic. That's not the same thing as saying that we're not going to match up on stuff, for example, murder. But it does mean that if there isn't a demonstration, for example, that homosexuality is wrong outside of having that quote-unquote biblical worldview, because I don't share that biblical worldview, therefore it doesn't follow that homosexuality is automatically off the table. That being said, there are lots of atheists who don't like homosexuality. I don't know what the stats are. There probably aren't that many of them, but they do technically exist. So, God, I didn't want to ramble. Maybe a better example would be like to compare it to Islam. So in Islam, we know that eating pork is considered haram. That's their phrase for something like that. So I'm not a Muslim. So for me, eating pork is not haram, and the concept of haram doesn't exist in my vocabulary. And for a person who comes from Islam, who grew up with hearing pork is haram, and there are things, haram is an idea that exists, when they see somebody who's not a Muslim, they're like, oh, you just want to be haram, don't you? I mean, I get why they have that, but it's just not, I'm sorry, it's not a valid point, because I don't understand haram, that idea, as existing in the first place, not because I proactively don't believe in things that are haram. It's that I am not part of a belief system that invented haram. Haram is not an obvious idea, and eating pork being haram is not an obvious idea that I would arrive at naturally. Same thing with Christian ideas about sin and sexuality. Same thing, pal. I'm really sorry, but so that's okay. I can appreciate why somebody has this invalid idea. It's not even the same thing as saying Christianity is invalid. It should be obvious to anybody that if somebody isn't a Christian, that ideas that only exist within a Christian framework and cannot be demonstrated without faith simply don't apply to us, because I don't have any faith. I don't think eating pork is haram. I don't think having gay sex is a sin. I'm not sure that haram exists. I'm not sure sin exists. Sorry. With regards to question 4, this is very similar to question 2, so I don't know why I have to repeat this again, but I'm going to. There are 3 dog piles. There are not 2 dog piles, true and false. That just isn't how modern epistemology works. We can't really know anything well enough to just flat out say something is true or something is false. So in the technical world of critical thinking and logic, what we do is there's really only 3 categories: proven, disproven, unproven. And things move around between these 3 categories based only on methodological naturalism and experimental reproducibility and nothing else. Now, when I say that God is in the unproven category, technically speaking, there's a lot of other stuff in this category too. Quantum string theory is in this category. I can't prove or disprove quantum string theory. Santa Claus is in this category. I can't do an experiment to prove or disprove Santa Claus. I can't do an experiment to prove or disprove elves. Okay? But not all the stuff in this, technically you're right, not everything in here is as equally likely. We can create subjective value judgments based on on everything that the human race has learned thus far to see how likely something is to actually one day get out of this category. And God, quite frankly, is way down on the bottom of that pile, right alongside vampires and elves. Okay? Now, we can't quantify. That's not something you can quantify. Oh, 50% likely, 70. That's not the language of epistemology. David Hume said we apportion our belief based on the evidence, but it's not really possible to create a mathematical model for that in all contexts. There's like, for example, the Bayesian model, where it's like, oh, the probability that this idea actually happened is this likely, but that's only in a specific context. So I can't quantify how likely I am to believe in God, but I have to do it by analogy. That's why. So rather than put a number on it, we do it by analogy. The likelihood that God is going to end up in the proven pile is about as likely as elves end up in the proven pile. See? So I don't have a number on it. I'm just going to say what's next to it. Elves, ghosts, things like this. So there's your, I guess you could, if you want to say like, 1% chance that God's ever going to make it into the proven pile. Technically, he sits in the unproven pile, okay? Is he going to go to disproven, right alongside flat Earth, or is he going to go to proven, right alongside the theory of evolution? Well, he's probably going to end up in here if he ever gets out of here, because there's a lot of stuff that we'll just never know. That's always going to be in the unproven pile, man, where there are things we'll never learn about this universe. But we can still subjectively say that in all likelihood, God is probably just like elves. Or like UFOs. I have no way of getting UFOs out of the unproven pile. Okay, but let's be kind of frank about it. UFOs are probably going to end up in here. They should probably be in here, but they're in here technically. So is God. There you go. So with regards to question 5, again, this underscores a lack of critical thinking, logic, and epistemology. I'm sorry to say that, because I see that this dude, Braxton Hunter, is really not trying to be combative. I can see it, but he still falls into the same tired and, quite frankly, embarrassing for Christians, semantic traps and okay, look. I'm just going to have to say a stupid, petty analogy, because I don't want to get tied up in the tedious details and ramble too much, okay? So, Sinbad the Sailor is a 12th century sailor and merchant from Arabia, and he gets on a boat, and he travels, and in his voyages, he ends up on an island called Zaratan. And on Zaratan Island, the native people who live there say, our island is actually a giant turtle, and we are standing on the back of that turtle. That's what this island is. And then Sinbad says, I don't believe you. And they say, well, where do you think our island comes from if it's not a giant turtle? And Sinbad says, I don't know. And Sinbad is correct, because as a guy who lives in the 12th century, he doesn't have access to modern science, so he has no idea where islands come from. So he says, I don't know. And then the inhabitants go, aha, your worldview doesn't explain the origin of Zaratan Island, but ours does. You see the fallacy here? I can reject a proposition without offering a counterproposition. The default position, proven, disproven, unproven, the origin of the universe, where do we come from, you're right, it's a blind spot. I don't have any clue what the ultimate origin of reality, what is the ultimate origin of things, of existing. But just because I can't answer that question doesn't mean I have to say that your answer is a good answer, right? I can reject your answer without trying to proffer an answer to this question and just accept the fact that I have a blind spot. Just like Sinbad the Sailor. Sinbad the Sailor has a blind spot. He doesn't know where islands come from. He doesn't know where Zaratan Island comes from. But that doesn't mean that his worldview is inferior to the inhabitants of that island who think their island is a turtle. Okay? Sorry, man. This is just a fallacy. It doesn't destabilize me in the least. I have no idea why we're here. I don't know where we come from. Maybe there's a God, maybe there's not. Maybe the universe is infinite. Why is that impossible? So again, it's impossible for the universe to be infinite. Guess what? That idea is a claim, and that claim is an unproven. That's also in the unproven pile. Infinite regress is not possible. That's unproven. Okay, and if you want to move that into the proven box, you have to use methodological naturalism and experimental reproducibility. Sorry, pal, that's what you have to use, not logic, not Thomas Aquinas and the rest of that. That's what we call arguments in lieu of evidence. It's the same fallacy Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels make. They don't use methodological naturalism and experimental reproducibility to demonstrate communism. They use logic to do it. They use something called dialectical materialism, which is a kind of logic to argue downward that communism is the only right way and everything else like capitalism is wrong. And that's just a fallacy. If you want to prove that, you got to use an experiment. You can't use logic for something like that. And it's the same thing with there can't be an infinite universe. It had to begin somewhere. That itself is also a claim, and that we don't have any way of proving that. And until we have a method to prove that, it's just not worth. It's just a blind spot that we all have. I have that blind spot, and so do you, man. You don't know where it came from. You just believe it came from somewhere. Okay. Proven, disproven, unproven, man. Every idea, every claim ever made, every idea anybody ever had about how things are begins its life in unproven, and is therefore it's wrong. It's a wrong idea by default. It can move to the disproven pile, in which case it's also wrong because it's been shown to be completely wrong. And then there's proven, which means that something is right. Only something in this pile is part of my universe, man. The only thing I integrate into my worldview, I guess when you say worldview, you mean the things I integrate into my real life application, has to be in this pile. Anything in these other two piles is not part of my universe, man. I'm sorry, it's not part of my worldview. I don't live my life around it. And that's why it's not destabilizing in the least. I don't think Zaratan Island is a turtle, and I don't have any good reason. I don't need to offer a counter explanation about where Zaratan Island came from in order to reject your turtle thesis. Okay? Same thing here, man. I'm sorry. I really don't want to be combative, but these are the same tired questions that Christians just keep. Wow. With regards to question 6, the frank answer is probably just none of them. The classical arguments for God, like the Kalam cosmological argument or the teleological, all the rest of them, man. Like, I'm really sorry to say this, but I've heard them all a million times, and I've seen them all debunked a million times, and they're all just kind of just similar. And I don't really see them as interesting, dude. I'm sorry. Yeah, and they're examples of what they call arguments in lieu of evidence. You're trying to use logic rather than methodological naturalism to prove something. So again, I'm really tired of doing this too. Proven, disproven, unproven. Everything starts here. Okay, proven, disproven, unproven. This is right, and both of these are wrong, and everything starts here by default, so everything is wrong by default. And you only get out of here into either of these other two through experimental reproducibility and methodological naturalism, okay? Logic doesn't let you move around. A lot of people get confused about that. A purely logical argument doesn't get you out of there. Logic is what I hate rambling. Logic is for a posteriori stuff. It's not for a priori stuff. A priori stuff, we need that experimental stuff. You need that empiricism. You need to demonstrate it. You need to demonstrate it in a lab, in the real world. You need to demonstrate that there can be no infinite regress. Therefore, there had to be an unmoved mover. You can't argue that with logic. Arguing it with logic is a posteriori. So you've developed a hypothesis. You have a hypothesis. The Kalam cosmological argument is a hypothesis. It's internally coherent, which means it's valid, but it's an unproven hypothesis. Unproven, okay? And you got to prove that there's no infinite regress. Sorry, pal. So with question 7, boy, do we really hit the nail on the head of all the really poor fallacies, lack of critical thinking, lack of understanding of epistemology, that highlights so much of Christianity. Okay, when atheists humbly admit that we can't know anything for certain, we're not saying that from a personal thing. We're saying that because in the world of pure epistemology, critical thinking, logic, it's all this. Okay, go read some books by Bertrand Russell, by Karl Popper, man. Go out there and do it, dude. Because look, or go study epistemology. Look, David Hume, all of those guys. Look, nothing can be known with absolute certainty. I don't know that I'm not a brain in a jar and this is all an illusion. I don't know if I don't live in the Matrix, man. I'm Keanu Reeves in the Matrix right now. I don't know. So that's the beginning point. The beginning point is that knowledge, epistemology, that's what the study of knowledge. If X is a variable, X is any piece of knowledge at all, how can I know X? How can I know if X is true or X is false? How can anybody know anything? So that's the first question you have to ask. Now, fast forwarding over thousands of years of epistemology and the development of logic and critical thinking, which are just inside of epistemology, okay, the only method we have as a species to demonstrate is to know anything is methodological naturalism and experimental reproducibility. Because we can't know anything with absolute certainty, the old-fashioned true and false bifurcation, that's gone. What we do is proven, disproven, unproven, right? And it's like a Monopoly game. Everything starts here in unproven. The only way you get to move out of unproven is with experimental, yes, it is always necessary, experimental reproducibility. And that's when you get to move around. So, and God is in here. And basically, faith, and if anybody else sees this video and wants to beat me up about because what I'm technically saying here is wrong. I'm trying to use layman's terms to explain this because boy, am I tired of it. The only method we have to move around between the three dog piles, proven, disproven, unproven, is through experimental reproducibility, methodological naturalism. That's it. So faith is basically a paradox because faith is asking you to believe in something that cannot be proven true. It's like a paradox. It's an infinity thing. The only method we have to demonstrate anything is through the material method of demonstrating it, okay? It has to be demonstrated. And the paradox is this, that only natural things, only things that exist in the material world can be proven that way. Now, that's not the same thing as saying that there are no supernatural things, that there are no immaterial things like God or ghosts. But here's the paradox. Because those things by definition are not natural, and because methodological naturalism is the only thing we have as a species to demonstrate something existing, we come to the paradox that anything that's supernatural by definition simply can never be proven. It can't be demonstrated. I know a lot of people are going to watch this, including other atheists, and say, oh, you're technically, that's not technically how it works, and you're right. I'm just trying to paraphrase here. I can only accept it if it's been demonstrated, and there is no demonstration, and by that I do mean that experimental reproducibility is the only demonstration, man. I'm sorry. That's it. Okay, I shouldn't say experimental reproducibility because, okay, I should say methodological naturalism, which is a big umbrella, and underneath of that are these different things. The most important one is experimental reproducibility, but in some scientific disciplines, especially the social sciences like anthropology, sociology, economics, they're not in a position where they can do experiments. Like, how am I going to do an experiment on the world economy? I'm not try getting a grant for that. No. So they technically acknowledge that they don't do that, but they use other methods that fall under that umbrella, and acknowledging that they don't use experimental reproducibility, they have other methods that they have to use. That doesn't save Christianity anymore either, because economics and anthropology, even though they don't use experimental reproducibility, there's two important points. They're still under that umbrella of methodological naturalism. And the second point that people just always tend to ignore is that anthropologists and economists and sociologists will be the first to tell you that their disciplines lack the rigor and certainty that physics and chemistry offer because they're not experimental. So even dyed-in-the-wool anthropologists will admit that their whole discipline is woolly compared to the physics and chemistry because they don't have that experimental option. So their theories are even more tenable and are less reliable. The same with economics. But regardless, there's no supernaturalism in there either. That's just out of the question. So basically, I'm never going to be a believer. And you can go ahead and call me closed-minded. I can't be a believer because I can't demonstrate. It can't be demonstrated that there's something that can't be demonstrated, right? It's a paradox. God is a paradox. Ghosts are a paradox. You can't, by definition, you can't use experimental reproducibility to demonstrate them because they're supernatural. They're not natural. So methodological naturalism doesn't apply to them. Therefore, they can never be demonstrated. And that means I can never believe in them. Sorry, that's what it is. If you want to call me closed-minded, then so be it. So with regards to question 8, I actually, from a personal point of view, think this is not such a bad question. But it doesn't really, maybe this is just about dialoguing between Christians and atheists. So I can only give my answer to this, and that is social issues had almost no bearing at all on my identifying as an atheist. So I should also point out that he mentioned deconversion stories. Now, that logically implies people who used to be Christian becoming non-Christian or becoming atheists or something. I was never Christian. So, but I also never became one because for me, it really was just about science and epistemology, critical thinking and logic. Is what it boiled down to. When I was very young, I came from a secular household. Obviously, I happen to be a white American person. I have European ancestry, so it kind of goes without saying that I have a Christian background, I guess. Obviously, at some point in my family tree, people were Christian, but I'm not. And the people in my household, we just never went to church, never did anything like that. I had extended family who had varying degrees of religion, but I was always very secular in my household. And we had interest in religion. We weren't anti-religion. We just didn't go to church and stuff. But by the time I got to junior high school and high school, that's when it really started to hit that there are lots of people who believe very fervently. But then there was also a lot of interesting stuff about science, about the theory of evolution, about the Big Bang, about the origins of the universe, the origins of species. And boy, that stuff was so fascinating to me as a kid. And I would study about dinosaurs, and I loved astronomy. I still have interests in these things, but admittedly, I'm not a scientifically minded guy, and I don't really follow it anymore. But that stuff was so fascinating to me as a kid. And then the reactions I got out of, for example, Christian people would vary. They really got bent out of shape over a lot of this stuff, and it was very confusing to me. It was like, why? Like for them, like for me, somebody comes up and presents, for example, the theory of evolution, and I look at it, I'm like, wow, that's interesting. That's an amazing concept. And then all of the religious kids, I should really say all of the Christian kids, so there are some of them who would put forward this thing like, oh, maybe God used evolution. And I'd hear that and I'd be like, I suppose. But that's kind of like tacked on. That's like, what does that got to do with it? And he's just describing the theory. And then there's other Christians who would just be like, wow, it's a lie, it's a lie. And then when they would make those kinds of accusations, it was very easy for science to just turn around and look like, it's not a lie, here's evidence. Okay? And then the other two groups, the liberal Christians and the conservative Christians, had nothing. Okay, the conservative Christians would fabricate like dishonest bullcrap. Okay, that the Earth is only in the ballpark of like several thousand years old, and you know the dinosaurs used to walk the Earth alongside humans at one point, and just ridiculous stuff that there's absolutely no evidence for. In fact, there's mountains of evidence against. And then the liberal Christians, they would accept what science was telling them, but they had this weird angsty feeling where they had to still tack on their belief at some point, or it'd be like, oh, but maybe God made it happen. And that's not even wrong, it's just irrelevant. It's like, oh, sure, maybe God made it happen. If there's a God, I suppose God used evolution as a tool, I suppose. But if there's not a God, then he didn't. I mean, what's your point, dude? It's kind of like saying there's a cloud in the sky. It's moving. God makes the cloud move. And then I say, well, maybe the wind is making it move. And it's like, well, how do you know God didn't make the wind move? And that made the cloud move. It's like, sure, okay. All you're doing is just pushing it back. I don't really care one way or the other. I didn't even start with a belief in God. So it's just like, I'm not looking for a place to plug him into the puzzle. It's the opposite for me. I need you to demonstrate that God would be in the puzzle anyway, without faith, without tradition, without any of that stuff. And none of them could ever do that. And that just seemed so very confusing and frustrating, and it makes Christian people a little bit scary. And then by the time I got into my 20s and I was in college, like Christianity lost anything, Social justice, I am very liberal. I am very pro-LGBTQ. I am very pro-choice, pro-abortion, whatever. But I don't lose a lot of sleep over it. And no, it didn't make me an atheist or drive me away from Christianity at all. That had nothing to do with it. It was all about the science and the logic and the epistemology, or the lack thereof. That was what it was all about. Now, I can't speak for all atheists, and to be fair to Braxton Hunter, he's making kind of a good point, because I do think there are some people who came to the destination I am at from a very different route, that maybe for them it was about the social stuff first, and then they encountered the critical thinking stuff later. But for me, it was the other way around. Like, I just was never part of it. And when I was in junior high school, it just completely, they shot themselves in the foot with their absurdities, and then I just never had it. And then later, it's just like, by the time I got to be a grown adult and all that stuff was behind me, I started encountering grown-up adult stuff like, gay, what is gay rights, or what is the government is supposed to do about fetuses? Should they be aborted in this and that context? And for me, because I didn't come from that Christian worldview, I ended up being a Democrat. But maybe not all atheists are that way. And anyway, it wasn't what led me here. That came later. With regards to question 9, no, I'll just be honest, I don't go around reading a lot of this stuff. Sorry. I mean, it just doesn't consume that much of my interest. It does a little bit, and yeah, I do watch a lot of, YouTube videos and stuff like this about it. But, I mean, to be blunt, a lot of the top-notch apologetic stuff, the stuff of it that I have read has not been very good. It's kind of like, okay, if somebody comes up, if I take, I'm sorry to make this analogy, I'm just going to make an analogy. If I take heroin and then get addicted to heroin, and then finally I conquer heroin, and I'm not addicted to it anymore, does somebody else get to turn around and say, well, have you tried cocaine? Well, have you tried this other drug? Like, I don't need to take every drug to know that I shouldn't do any drug. That's a fallacy, because then there's simply not enough time in our lives to try every single thing, to do every single thing. The credibility of your argument should be enough to win me over, and I shouldn't have to constantly go out and try to debunk you. And it's the same thing here. I'm not going to spend the rest of my life reading every apologetics book. If an apologetics book comes out that conclusively demonstrates that God exists with as much certainty as we can demonstrate that black holes exist, then I guess that's something then I'll start taking notice. But if it's just another apologetics book that rehashes the Kalam cosmological argument or the teleological argument that people thought of in the 12th century and which has already been debunked, and all they're doing is rephrasing it again, I don't need to go out and read every book published every day. Just like I don't need to take every drug to reject all drugs, I don't need to read every apologetics book to reject apologetics. I'm sorry. And you're going to accuse me of being disingenuous, and maybe it is a little bit, I don't know. But I have a sampling of it. I've read, back in the day, I read some book. A little bit later, I read another book. I saw a change happen from here to here. I saw the evolution of apologetics as a discipline in this very narrow band, and I saw that it sucked. I haven't gone past that band, but I have no good reason to. With regards to question 10, sure, if Christianity were demonstrated to be true, I would be a Christian. Why wouldn't I? But you're getting ahead of yourself, because it hasn't.